Welcome to Wild Cowboy Tales. Before we step into the shadow of a ruined chapel and walk a trail of bloody lace, do yourself a favor and subscribe to our channel. Ring that notification bell, because you won't want to miss a single story of love, loss, and vengeance from the untamed heart of the American West. Now, settle in, and listen to the legend of the woman they called the Widow in Red, a bride whose wedding vows were answered with gunfire, and who swore that not even the grave would hold her vengeance. The sun over the small, hopeful town of Havens Hope was a benediction. It streamed through the newly glazed windows of the small community church, painting the dusty air in columns of golden light. For Laura, standing at the simple wooden altar, that light felt like a promise, a divine seal on the perfect, simple joy of this day. She was a vision in white, in a dress she had spent 100 hours sewing with her own hands, its lace as delicate as a spider's web, its buttons the color of pearl. This dress was the culmination of a life of quiet dreams, a life about to be joined with that of David, the man who was her anchor, her future, her home. David stood beside her, his hand holding hers. He was a young deputy, strong and kind, his goodness as plain and as true as the polished pine of the pews. He was the sort of man who could build a life and a town, and Havens Hope was a town built on the promise of men like him. In the pews sat their friends, their neighbors, the small collection of souls who had carved this town from the wilderness. The air was thick with the scent of wildflowers and beeswax, and the low, happy murmur of a community celebrating one of its own. Laura looked at David's smiling face as the preacher began to speak the familiar, sacred words, and her heart felt so full it might burst. The hard years of her youth, losing her parents, making her own way as a seamstress, had all led to this single, perfect moment. This was the start of everything. The world outside, with its harshness and its dangers, felt a million miles away. Here, in this small, sunlit church, there was only peace. The first sound that broke the spell was not the preacher's "I do," but the splintering crash of the church doors being kicked in. The sound was a violation, a sacrilege. Every head turned. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the bright, afternoon sun, were 5 figures. They were not wedding guests. They were specters from a different world, a world of dust, blood, and casual cruelty. At their head was a man named Silas Kane, a cattle baron from the north whose ambition was as vast and as barren as the territory he sought to control. David had recently arrested one of his men for murder, a brave and foolish act of law against a man who considered himself above it. Kane had come not just for his man, but for retribution, to make an example, to teach this upstart town a lesson in fear. With him were the dregs of his employ, a hulking brute named Goliath, a twitchy knife fighter called Finch, and a cold-eyed second-in-command Court. The world devolved into a nightmare of screams and shouting. The wedding guests scrambled for cover as Kane and his men strode down the aisle, their spurs ringing on the wooden floor like a death knell. "Well now, deputy," Kane said, a cruel, leisurely smile on his face. "Looks like we're interrupting your big day. A shame. I do enjoy a good wedding." David pushed Laura behind him, his hand going to the pistol holstered at his side, a weapon he had hoped he would never have to draw in this sacred place. "This is a house of God, Kane," David said, his voice steady despite the tremor of rage running through him. "Take your business outside." Kane chuckled. "My business is with you, boy. You stuck your nose where it didn't belong. You cost me a good man." "He was a murderer," David retorted. "He was my murderer," Kane corrected. "And now, you're going to pay for him." It all happened in a blur of horrific, slow-motion clarity. David drew his gun, but he was one man against 5. Before he could even bring the barrel to bear, a shout roared from Kane's hip. The bullet struck David in the chest. Laura felt a hot, wet spray across the front of her dress. She looked down in a daze at the pristine white lace, now blossoming with a grotesque, impossible flower of the deepest crimson. She looked up at David. A look of profound, bewildered surprise was on his face. He staggered back, his eyes finding hers, his lips forming her name. Then he collapsed at her feet, his blood pooling on the altar steps, the stain on her dress spreading, a tide of red consuming the white. A scream, a sound of a soul being torn in two, was ripped from Laura's throat. She fell to her knees, her hands going to David's body, her mind refusing to process what her eyes were seeing. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. Cain and his men were laughing. It was the laughter of wolves, the sound of utter, remorseless evil. Alara looked up at them, her eyes blazing with a hatred so pure, so absolute. It was a physical force. "You," she whispered, the word a venomous curse. Cain's smile faded as he looked into her eyes. He saw something there that unnerved him. He raised his pistol again. "A loose end," he said, his voice flat. Another shot roared through the church. A searing, white-hot pain exploded in Alara's side, and the world, which had already been a nightmare, dissolved completely into a silent, welcoming darkness. She collapsed over the body of her husband, her blood mingling with his, the beautiful wedding dress now a tattered, crimson shroud. The last thing she was aware of was the sound of Cain and his men riding away, their laughter echoing in the ruins of her life. Death, they say, is a quiet country. For Alara, it was a silent, velvet darkness, a gentle, floating peace that was a profound mercy after the horror of her last waking moments. She drifted in this void, and tethered from the pain, from the grief. She was with David again, in that peaceful, sunlit space before the world had ended. It would have been easy to let go, to allow the gentle current to carry her away for good. But a promise, unspoken but absolute, held her back. The promise she had seen in David's eyes in his final moment. The promise of a life they were supposed to have, a future they were supposed to build. And mingling with that love was the hot, burning memory of Silas Cain's laughter. That laughter was an anchor, a jagged, cruel thing that refused to let her soul drift away. It pulled her back, slowly, tortuously, into the world of the living. Her first sensation was pain, a deep, throbbing, relentless fire in her side. Her second was cold, a damp, earthen cold that seemed to be seeping into her bones. She opened her eyes. She was not in the church. She was in a shallow, hastily dug grave behind it, thrown in with the other victims of the massacre. A thin layer of dirt had been shoveled over her, a crude, final act of disposal. The world thought she was dead. The killers thought she was dead. In every way that mattered, she was. A groan escaped her lips. It was a sound of both agony and life. It was heard. A figure, silhouetted against the moon, stood over the grave. It was the old town doctor, a man named Elias, who had returned to the church after the outlaws had gone, to tend to the dead with a heavy heart. He had seen a flicker of movement, a twitch of a hand, and had, against all hope, pulled her from the pit. The weeks that followed were a blur of pain and fevered dreams. Elias took her to his small, isolated cabin on the edge of town, hiding her, nursing her. The bullet had torn through her side, missing any vital organs by a miracle of inches, but the wound was deep, and the fever raged. During her delirium, she lived the massacre over and over. She saw David fall, she felt the blood on her dress, she heard the laughter. She would cry out in her sleep, not in sorrow, but in a raw, guttural rage, whispering the names of the killers she had etched into her memory. Elias, a man who had seen his share of the West's brutality, recognized the signs. He was not just healing a wound in her body, he was witnessing the birth of a terrible, unshakable purpose in her soul. When the fever finally broke, it left her impossibly weak, but her mind was a shard of ice. The soft, hopeful woman who had planned to be a wife was gone, burned away. What was left was a vessel of cold, hard grief. She did not weep. She did not speak of her loss. She simply looked at Elias with eyes that had seen the other side of the grave, and she asked him a single question. "Can you teach me how to shoot?" Elias, a former soldier, sighed, a sound of profound sadness. "Vengeance is a ghost that haunts the hunter more than the hunted, child," he warned. "I am already a ghost," Alara replied, her voice a low, chilling rasp that sounded alien coming from her lips. "I just need to learn how to haunt." And so began her grim education. As her body healed, she pushed it past its limits. The hands that had known only the delicacy of a needle and thread now learned the hard, brutal weight of a gun. Elias taught her everything he knew. He taught her the cold mechanics of the Colt revolver, the patience of the long rifle, the brutal intimacy of the knife and the hatchet. He taught her to track, to fight, to endure. He was not training a woman, he was sharpening a weapon. She had one possession left from her former life: the wedding dress. Elias had cleaned it as best he could, but the crimson stains were a part of the fabric now, a permanent, gruesome map of her tragedy. It was a ragged, horrific thing. Alara did not burn it. She kept it, folded carefully in an old wooden chest. It was not a dress anymore. It was her vow. It was her armor. It was the flag of her one-woman war. She disappeared from the world. The official story was that Alara, the beautiful young bride, had died with her husband in the Heaven's Hope massacre, a tragic footnote in a brutal story. Her name was carved on a wooden cross in the town's small cemetery. But the woman who had been Alara was very much alive, hidden in the mountains, reforging herself in a crucible of sorrow and hate. The grave they had thrown her in had not been deep enough. It had not held her body, and she had sworn a silent, terrible oath that no grave on earth would ever hold her vengeance. The seasons turned, and the world outside Elias's mountain sanctuary moved on. The memory of the Heaven's Hope massacre faded into just another bloody tale in a territory full of them. But in the high, lonely wilderness, time was measured differently. It was measured in the slow healing of a wound, the growing calluses on a woman's hands, and the steady, relentless honing of a single, deadly purpose. Alara, the ghost, was being forged. Elias was a relentless and unforgiving teacher. He saw the fire in her, and he knew that if he did not teach her to control it, to channel it, it would consume her before she ever fired a shot. He started not with weapons, but with the land itself. He took away her shoes and made her walk barefoot on the rocks until the soles of her feet were as tough as leather. He taught her to be silent, to move through the thickest brush without snapping a twig, to use the wind and the shadows as her allies. "The mountains don't care about your anger," he would say, his voice a low rumble. "They only respect strength and silence. You want to be a ghost. You must learn to be a part of the stillness." He taught her to endure. He would leave her for days at a time with only a knife and the clothes on her back, forcing her to learn to find water, to set snares, to live off the harsh bounty of the wilderness. She learned the quiet patience of the predator, the art of the long watch, the grim necessity of the kill. The soft, civilized woman was stripped away, layer by layer, until only a core of pure, resilient survival remained. Then came the weapons. He did not hand her a pistol and tell her to shoot. He made her take it apart and put it back together 100 times, in the dark, until she knew every screw, every spring, every piece of its deadly architecture. "This is not a magic wand," he drilled into her. "It is a machine. You must be its master, not the other way around." Her first shots were clumsy, the recoil jarring her slight frame. But she was a relentless student. Fueled by the faces of the men she saw in her mind's eye, she practiced from sunup to sundown. The sharp crack of her revolver became a constant echo in the valley. She learned to shoot with a cold, detached precision, to control her breathing, to make every bullet a deliberate, final statement. The hatchet was different. It was a brutal, intimate weapon, a tool from her old life transformed into an instrument of her new one. Elias taught her to use it not just as a throwing weapon, but as a close-quarters extension of her own body. He taught her the deadly dance of blocking, parrying, and striking, a whirlwind of motion designed to overcome a stronger opponent. The hatchet became her signature, a symbol of the raw, visceral nature of her grief. But Elias's most important lessons were not about fighting. They were about the cost of it. "Every man you kill will take a piece of you with him," he told her one night, as they sat by the fire. "You will see their faces in your sleep. You will carry their weight for the rest of your days. Make sure the debt they owe is worth the price you will pay to collect it." During this time, the wedding dress remained in its chest, a silent, powerful presence. One day, a year into her training, she took it out. It was a ghost of a garment, its delicate lace torn, its white fabric now a permanent, mottled canvas of brown and rust red. She held it up, and in it, she saw not the memory of her lost love, but the reflection of her future. She took her seamstress shears, the last tool of her old trade, and began to alter it. She cut away the long train, shortened the sleeves, and reinforced the seams, transforming the once beautiful gown into a practical, if horrific, uniform. It was an act of desecration and consecration. She was destroying the symbol of her old life to create the armor for her new one. The day finally came when Elias knew he could teach her no more. She was no longer his student. She was a weapon of her own making, a woman as hard and as unforgiving as the mountains that had been her forge. She stood before him, dressed in dark, practical buckskins, her face leaner, harder, her eyes holding a chilling, focused calm. "I'm ready," she said. It was not a question. "I know," Elias said, his voice heavy. He handed her a worn gun belt and a heavy bag of coins. "This was my last bounty. A man needs a stake to start a war." "I have a list," she said, her voice flat. "Finch, the knife man. He favors the border towns. I'll start there. And after him." "One by one," she replied, "until the list is finished." As she saddled her horse, Elias gave her one last piece of advice. "Don't let them see Alara," he said. "Alara is a woman. A woman can be hurt. She can be reasoned with. Let them see only the ghost. Let them see the dress. Let them see the legend. Fear is a better weapon than any bullet." She nodded, a final, grim understanding passing between them. She rode out of the valley without looking back. She was leaving behind the last sanctuary she would ever know. She was riding down from the mountains, a specter of vengeance descending upon an unsuspecting world. The whispers had not yet begun, but they soon would. The story of the bride who died and came back was about to be written, and its first chapter would be penned in blood. The border town of Ter's Cruces was a festering wound on the lip of the desert, a place where the laws of God and man were forgotten as soon as the sun went down. It was a haven for thieves, killers, and lost souls, a perfect place for a man like Finch to ply his trade. He was a creature of the shadows, a knife fighter who preferred the close, dirty work of the alleyway to the open confrontation of the street. He had taken his share of the blood money from Haven's Hope and had established himself as an official enforcer for the town's most powerful saloon owner, a position that gave him ample opportunity to indulge his love for violence and cheap tequila. Alara arrived in Ter's Cruces not as a storm, but as a subtle shift in the air. She was a ghost, just as Elias had taught her. She took a room in a quiet boarding house, presenting herself as a grieving widow named Sarah, her face perpetually hidden behind a thick, black veil. She was a figure of quiet, unobtrusive sorrow, and the rough men of the town gave her a wide, almost respectful berth. She became a part of the town's scenery, a shadow that no one noticed, and all the while, she was watching, listening, learning. She learned Finch's routine. He spent his days sleeping, his nights prowling the saloons and gambling dens. He had a predictable path, a circuit of his squalid little kingdom. She learned his tells, the way he would nervously touch the hilt of the Bowie knife tucked in his belt, the way his eyes would constantly dart around. A paranoid tic that betrayed the coward beneath the killer's reputation. She waited for a week, her patience a cold, coiled thing. She chose her moment, the night of the new moon, when the alleys of Ter's Cruces would be plunged into an inky, absolute blackness. This would be the night she would introduce the world to the widow in red. In the quiet of her small room, she began her ritual. She took out the wedding dress. It was no longer a symbol of love and hope, it was a declaration of war. As she slipped the tattered, blood-stained garment over her buckskins, she felt a transformation. The quiet, grieving Sarah receded, and the ghost, the instrument of vengeance, took her place. The dress was a second skin, a shroud of purpose. She strapped on her gun belt, the hatchet hanging heavy at her side. She looked at her reflection in the cracked mirror. The woman looking back was a terrifying specter, a bride of death. She found Finch in his usual spot at the Coyote's House Saloon, bullying a young card dealer he had accused of cheating. Alara did not enter. She waited across the street, a deeper shadow in the darkness of a merchant's doorway. She waited for him to emerge. When he finally stumbled out into the street, drunk and belligerent, she made her move. She didn't call out his name. She let him see her. She stepped out of the doorway and began to walk slowly toward the center of the street, positioning herself directly under the faint, flickering light of a single lantern. Finch saw her, and at first, he just saw a woman in a strange, ragged dress. He let out a leering, drunken chuckle. "Well now, what have we here? You lost, little lady." But as she drew closer, as the lantern light caught the details of her attire with torn lace, the dark, unmistakable patterns of old blood, his laughter died in his throat. He had been there that day. He had seen the bride fall. A wave of superstitious, alcohol-fueled terror washed over him. "No," he whispered, his hand instinctively going to his knife. "It can't be. You're dead. You were mistaken." Alara's voice cut through the night, a sound as cold and as sharp as a shard of ice. "I am the bride you and Silas Kane made a widow. The name of his boss, spoken so plainly, so certainly, sobered him instantly. This was no ghost. This was something far more real, and far more dangerous. "You've made a mistake coming here," he snarled, his fear turning to aggression. He began to back away, toward the familiar, comforting darkness of an alleyway, his preferred fighting ground. Alara led him. She followed, her steps slow, deliberate. This was his dance, and she would let him lead, for now. He backed into the alley, and she followed, the sounds of the saloon fading behind them, leaving them in a close, suffocating silence. In the darkness, he was a different animal. He was fast. The Bowie knife, a foot of polished steel, was in his hand, a pale gleam in the gloom. He lunged, not with a wild slash, but with a practiced, deadly thrust aimed at her heart. But Alara was ready. This was the fight Elias had trained her for. She didn't meet his lunge with force. She moved with him, a fluid, sideways step, letting his momentum carry him past her. In the same motion, the hatchet was in her hand. She didn't swing to kill. She brought the flat of the blade down hard on his knife hand. There was a sickening crunch of bone. Finch screamed, a high, thin sound, as the Bowie knife clattered to the ground. His hand was a broken, useless thing. He staggered back, clutching his shattered hand, his face a mask of agony and disbelief. "Who are you?" he howled. "I am a promise," she said, her voice a low whisper. She advanced on him, the hatchet now held in a deadly, ready grip. He was disarmed, wounded, trapped. The predator had become the prey. "Please," he whimpered, his bravado gone, replaced by the pathetic, pleading terror of a cornered rat. "I was just following orders. Kane paid me. And now, I will pay you," Alara said. The hatchet moved, a blur in the darkness. It was not a wild, angry swing. It was a precise, controlled, and utterly final act of justice. She left him in the filth of the alley. She did not linger. She walked back out into the street, a ghostly figure in her blood-stained dress. As she passed the saloon, a few curious patrons who had stepped out onto the boardwalk saw her. They saw the tattered, crimson-lace gown. They saw the hatchet in her hand, now dripping with a fresh, dark liquid. And they saw her eyes, cold and empty, the eyes of a woman who had just stared into hell and had not flinched. She mounted her horse and rode out of Ter's Cruces, disappearing back into the desert night. She left behind a dead man and a story. The story, told in hushed, terrified whispers, would spread faster than any wildfire. It was the story of a ghost, a bride who had come back from the grave, dressed in her own bloody wedding gown, to collect a debt. They didn't know her name, but they had a name for the legend. They called her the Widow in Red. The legend of the Widow in Red spread through the territory like a fever. It was a story told in hushed tones around campfires and in the smoky corners of saloons, a tale that grew more mythic with each telling. They said she was a ghost who could not be killed by a bullet. They said she wore her own bloody wedding dress as a warning. They said she hunted with a hatchet and paid her debts in blood. The story reached the ears of Silas Kane in his northern ranch, and it was a story that turned the cattle baron's confidence to a cold, gnawing dread. He sent riders out with a warning and a new, hefty bounty for the other two surviving members of his gang. His message was simple: kill the ghost, or she will kill you. The second name on Alara's list was Goliath. The name was an apt one. He was a mountain of a man, a creature of immense physical strength and limited intellect. He was the muscle of Kane's operation, a human battering ram who solved every problem with his fists or the massive, custom-made revolver he carried on his hip. After the massacre, Goliath had taken his blood money and drifted into the rugged timber country of the Northern Territories, finding work as an enforcer for a corrupt logging company that was using intimidation and violence to drive smaller outfits off their claims. He was a bully in his natural habitat, a big fish in a small, violent pond. Alara's hunt for Goliath was a different challenge. He was not a creature of the shadows like Finch. He was a force of nature, always surrounded by the rough, hard-bitten loggers who formed his new gang. A direct confrontation would be suicide. She knew she could not match his strength. She would have to use his own brute force, and the environment he now called home, against him. She arrived in the logging town of Pinneridge as she had in Ter's Cruces, a ghost. She was again the veiled, grieving widow Sarah, a woman who attracted no attention. She took a job mending clothes for the loggers, a position that allowed her to move through the camp, to listen, to observe. She saw Goliath in his element, a swaggering, belligerent king, his laughter a booming, ugly sound that made her blood run cold. She remembered that laugh from the church. She spent weeks mapping out the logging operation. She learned the trails, the cutting sites, the schedule of the timber transport. And she saw the simmering resentment of the independent loggers whom Goliath and his men were terrorizing. They were good, hard-working men, but they were intimidated by Goliath's sheer brutality. In them, she saw a potential, if unwitting, army. Her campaign against Goliath was one of sabotage and superstition. She began to disrupt the logging operation in ways that seemed like accidents or bad luck. A crucial saw blade would be found with a hairline fracture, rendering it useless. A winch cable, responsible for hauling massive logs, would snap at a critical moment, sending a cascade of timber down a hillside. These were small acts, but they cost the company time and money, and they began to fray the nerves of the crew. Then, she introduced the ghost. She used her knowledge of the forest to become a whisper in the pines. She would create strange, unsettling sounds in the night, a mournful, womanly cry carried on the wind, the sharp and natural crack of a branch in the dead of night. She began to leave signs, a single, wilting white rose left on a tree stump, a piece of torn, blood-stained lace snagged on a branch near a work site. The loggers, a superstitious lot by nature, began to talk. They spoke of the spirit of the forest, a vengeful female ghost who was angered by the company's clear cutting. The stories of the widow in red from the south had not yet reached this remote corner of the territory, so they created their own legend to explain the strange, unnerving events. Goliath, a man who believed only in the tangible reality of his own fists, laughed off the stories, calling his men cowards and fools. His arrogance was his undoing. Alara knew it was time to draw him out, to separate the beast from his pack. She chose her stage, a deep, treacherous ravine known as Dead Man's Drop, which was spanned by a narrow, rickety-looking timber bridge used to transport logs. Her final act of sabotage was her most audacious. She learned that a massive, prize-winning redwood, a tree the company owner had been obsessed with felling, was scheduled to be hauled across the bridge. The night before, she slipped out to the bridge. She was not a saboteur, she was a seamstress. She used her skills not with a needle and thread, but with a saw and a chisel. She didn't cut the main supports. She weakened them, carving away at the joints, leaving them just strong enough to hold, but not strong enough to bear a great weight. The next day, as the crew prepared to haul the giant redwood across the bridge, she made her appearance. She waited until Goliath himself was on the bridge, supervising the operation, shouting orders, his massive frame a perfect target. She appeared on the far side of the ravine, 100 yards away. She was not the veiled widow. She was the widow in red, her tattered, blood-stained wedding dress a shocking, horrific splash of color against the green of the forest. The loggers saw her first. A collective gasp went through the men. The ghost from their stories was real. They stared, frozen, at the terrifying apparition. Goliath turned, following their gaze. He saw her. He saw the dress. And unlike his men, he recognized it. He had seen it crumpled on a church floor, soaked in a dead man's blood. The color drained from his face. The ghost from his past had found him. "You," he breathed, his voice a choked whisper. "It's my turn to laugh, Goliath." Alara's voice, clear and cold, echoed across the ravine. Her appearance, and his reaction, was the spark that ignited the fear in his men. They broke and ran, scrambling away from the bridge, away from the ghost, away from the man they now realized was cursed. They abandoned him. Goliath was alone, trapped in the middle of the bridge. His fear quickly turned to a cornered animal's rage. He drew his massive revolver, a gun that looked like a cannon in his huge fist. "I'll send you back to hell, you bitch," he roared, and fired. The heavy-caliber bullet tore through the air, but Alara had already moved, diving behind a large boulder. She did not fire back. She had another weapon. As Goliath was firing, the crew at the winch, spooked and confused, had let the massive redwood log slip. It began to roll, slowly at first, then with gathering, unstoppable momentum, onto the already groaning bridge. Goliath heard the splintering of wood, felt the bridge tremble beneath his feet. He turned and saw the monster of a log rolling toward him. He had a choice: face the ghost in front of him, or the rolling death behind him. He scrambled to get off the bridge, but it was too late. With a sound like a thunderclap, the weakened supports of the bridge gave way. The entire structure of log, the equipment, and the massive, screaming form of Goliath plunged into the ravine below. The crash echoed through the forest for a long, final moment, and then there was silence. Alara stood and looked down into the splintered wreckage. She had not fired a shot. She had not thrown her hatchet. She had used the man's own world, his own blind force, to destroy him. She turned and walked back into the forest, leaving the loggers to tell the tale of how the spirit of the woods had claimed the brute who had wronged her. The widow in red had collected her second payment, and her legend, now stained with the sap of the pines as well as the blood of men, continued to grow. The story of Goliath's demise at Dead Man's Drop was a tale that took on the texture of folklore. The loggers who witnessed it spoke not of a woman, but of a spirit, a bride of the forest who had risen to protect the land. The details of the blood-stained dress were the same, but the legend was now entwined with the supernatural, making the widow in red seem less like a human agent of vengeance and more like an elemental force of nature. This growing myth was Alara's greatest shield and most potent weapon. While the law might hunt a woman, they were far more reluctant to venture into territories haunted by a ghost. This myth, carried south by travelers and traders, finally reached Silas Kane. He listened to the wild, unbelievable story, and his blood ran cold. He recognized the pattern, the systematic dismantling of his men, the theatrical, symbolic nature of their deaths. This was the work of the woman from the church. The ghost had a name, and he knew it was Alara. Kane was not a man to be trifled with by superstitious tales. He was a pragmatist, a creature of cold, hard calculation. He now understood the true nature of the threat against him. This was not a random series of attacks, it was a methodical, personal vendetta. He was being hunted, and he was next on the list after his second-in-command court. His carefully constructed world of wealth and power, which had seemed so secure, now felt fragile, built on a foundation of blood that was threatening to liquefy beneath him. He retreated to his sprawling ranch, the Barquet, and turned it into a fortress. He doubled his guard, hiring the most ruthless gunslingers money could buy. He became a prisoner in his own castle, his days marked by a gnawing paranoia, his nights by whiskey-fueled nightmares. He sent out riders with a new, astronomical bounty on the widow's head and a direct, urgent message to court. Wherever he might be hiding, she is real. She is coming for us all. Fortify. Meanwhile, Alara was facing a crisis of a different kind. After the death of Goliath, she had retreated back into the wilderness, the silence of the forest a necessary balm after the violence. The internal conflict that Elias had warned her of was beginning to take root. With each act of vengeance, she felt a piece of her old self, the gentle Alara who had loved David, die. She was becoming the widow, her entire being defined by the hunt, by the cold satisfaction of the kill. She was haunted. In her dreams, David's face, once a source of comfort, now often appeared to her with a look of sorrow, as if he didn't recognize the woman she had become. The thrill of the hunt, the cold, clear focus she felt when she was closing in on her prey, was a feeling that both empowered and frightened her. She was becoming addicted to the very poison she was dispensing. Her internal struggle was given a face when she stumbled upon a small, isolated homestead. A familiar husband, a wife, and a young daughter whose land was being threatened by a neighboring rancher, a man who had ties to one of Silas Kane's business ventures. The family was being systematically terrorized, their fences cut, their well poisoned, in an attempt to drive them off their land. Alara, hiding her identity, watched them for several days. She saw in them a heartbreaking reflection of her own lost life. She saw their quiet courage, their love for each other and their land. And she saw their fear. One evening, the ranchers hired thugs, emboldened by the family's lack of resistance, rode to the homestead to deliver a final, violent warning. The old Alara would have done nothing. The widow's path was a solitary one. This was not her fight. But looking at the small family huddled in their cabin, at the young girl with eyes as wide and as terrified as her own had once been, she was faced with a choice. Was she simply a vessel of vengeance, a creature of the past? Or was there something else left inside her? She made a decision. That night, she did not don the wedding dress. She was not the widow. She was simply a protector. She used her skills not to kill, but to defend. She became a ghost in the night, a silent guardian. She used traps and misdirection to spook the thugs' horses. She used her hatchet not to kill, but to sever their saddle girths, sending them tumbling into the dirt. She used her rifle not to shoot them, but to shoot the lanterns from their hands, plunging them into a confusing darkness. The thugs, terrified by an unseen, impossibly efficient enemy, fled. They reported back to their boss that the homestead was haunted, protected by a demon of the night. The family was, for the moment, safe. Alara slipped away before dawn, having never spoken a word to the family she had saved. But the act had changed her. For the first time since the massacre, she had used her deadly skills not to exact a price for the past, but to protect the future. The feeling it gave her was complex and settling. It was a flicker of the woman she had once been, a warmth in the cold emptiness of her soul. The experience did not deter her from her path. Her resolve to kill Court and Kane was as strong as ever. But it had planted a seed of doubt, a question. What would happen after the last name was crossed off her list? What would she be when the vengeance was done? For the first time, she began to think not just about the end of her hunt, but about the day after. And that thought, the terrifying, fragile possibility of a future, was a heavier weight than any weapon she carried. Court was a man who lived by a simple, brutal code: loyalty to the highest bidder and survival at any cost. As Silas Kane's second in command, he was the strategic mind behind the gang's most ruthless operations. It was Court who had planned the logistics of the Haven's Hope raid, who had coolly given the order to leave no witnesses. Unlike the simple brute Goliath or the cowardly Finch, Court was a professional, a cold and calculating killer who understood the mechanics of violence. When Kane's warning reached him, he did not panic. He prepared. He had taken his share of the money and bought a remote, abandoned silver mine in the foothills of the Sierra Nevadas, a place called the Devil's Mow. The mine was a natural fortress, a labyrinth of tunnels and shafts, with a single, easily defensible entrance. He had hired a small, loyal crew of hard-bitten miners and gunslingers, men who asked no questions. He was confident that no ghost, no matter how legendary, could touch him in his subterranean kingdom. Alara's journey to the Devil's Maw was long and arduous. She was a different woman from the one who had hunted Finch and Goliath. The encounter at the homestead had unsettled her, cracking the icy certainty of her mission. The question of what comes after was a constant, nagging whisper in her mind. But as she drew closer to the mine, as the memory of Court's cold, impassive face on her wedding day came into sharper focus, the old, familiar fire of her hatred burned away the fog of doubt. Court was not a simple thug. He was an architect of her misery. His death was not just a payment, it was a necessity. She arrived at the Devil's Maw and saw immediately that a direct assault was impossible. The entrance was guarded day and night. The surrounding hills offered little cover. She would have to go under. She spent a week exploring the area, searching for old geological surveys in a nearby town's archives. She was looking for a back door, a forgotten ventilation shaft, a secret that even Court didn't know about. And she found it, a narrow, collapsed air shaft on the far side of the mountain, a mile from the main entrance, a passage that was considered impassable. For 3 days, she worked, using her bare hands and her hatchet to clear the rubble from the collapsed shaft. It was grueling, dangerous work. Finally, she broke through into a narrow, dark tunnel, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and stale gunpowder. She was inside. What followed was a tense, claustrophobic hunt in the bowels of the earth. She moved through the labyrinth of tunnels like a phantom, her senses on high alert. The only light was the faint, flickering glow of her small lantern. The darkness was absolute, the silence broken only by the drip of water and the distant, echoing clang of pickaxes from Court's mining operation. She did not go for Court first. She began to dismantle his operation from the inside out, turning his fortress into his tomb. She used her intimate knowledge of mining, gleaned from her seamstress work for prospectors, against them. A support timber, crucial to a main tunnel, would be found mysteriously weakened, causing a minor but terrifying cave-in that cut off a section of the mine. A crate of dynamite would be found with its fuses mysteriously soaked in water, rendering it useless. His men, already on edge from the widow's legend, began to crack. They were trapped underground, haunted by a saboteur they could not see. They started arguing, accusing each other. Court's authority, built on fear and control, began to crumble in the face of an enemy he couldn't see or fight. Elara chose her moment to strike. She found one of Court's men, a lone guard patrolling a deep, isolated tunnel. She did not kill him. She emerged from the darkness, the blood-stained wedding dress a horrific, unbelievable sight in the lantern light. The man was so terrified he dropped his rifle and fell to his knees, babbling for mercy. "I am not here for you," she said, her voice a low whisper that seemed to be absorbed by the rock walls. "I am here for Court. Give him a message. Tell him his bride is waiting for him." In the chapel. The chapel was a massive, central cavern in the mine, where a natural rock formation resembled a crude altar, a place the miners had sardonically named. She left the terrified man and disappeared back into the darkness. The message sent the last of Court's men fleeing. They scrambled out of the mine, taking their chances with the wilderness rather than facing the ghost in the tunnels. Court was left alone, his crew deserted, his fortress now a silent, echoing tomb. He was a professional. He would not run. He would make his last stand. He went to the chapel, his shotgun loaded. A dozen lanterns hung from the rock walls, flooding the massive cavern with a bright, flickering light. He would not be taken in the dark. Elara entered the cavern not from one of the main tunnels, but from above. She had climbed up a narrow, treacherous rock chimney and was perched on a high ledge, hidden in the shadows above the lantern light. She watched as Court stood by the rock altar, his shotgun held at the ready, his eyes scanning the tunnel entrances. "I know you're here, you bitch," he yelled, his voice a tight, controlled roar that bounced off the cavern walls. "Come out and face me. No more games. There are no more games, Court." Her voice drifted down from the darkness above him, a disembodied, ghostly sound. "Only a final accounting." He spun, firing a blast from the shotgun toward the sound of her voice, the pellets ricocheting wildly and harmlessly off the cavern ceiling. While he was looking up, she dropped. She had a rope. She swung down from the ledge, landing silently on the cavern floor behind him. He heard the soft thud of her boots on the sandy floor and turned, his face a mask of disbelief. She stood 20 feet from him, the wedding dress a tattered, ghostly white in the lantern light. The hatchet was in one hand, her Colt in the other. "The bride," he whispered, a flicker of something that might have been fear finally entering his cold eyes. "The widow," she corrected. What followed was a final, desperate battle amidst the stone pillars of the cavern. It was a fight of tactics and nerve. Court used the rock altar for cover, the shotgun a devastating weapon in the echoing space. Elara used her speed and her knowledge of the terrain she had just traversed, darting between the shadows and the stalagmites. Then came when Elara threw her hatchet. It was not aimed at him. It spun through the air and struck the main rope from which half the lanterns were hung. The rope snapped, and a half-dozen burning lanterns crashed to the cavern floor, plunging half the room into a sudden, disorienting darkness and throwing pools of burning oil across the ground. In the confusion of the shifting light and shadows, Elara moved in. Court, momentarily blinded, fired his last shotgun shell into the darkness. Elara, guided by the muzzle flash, fired her Colt. The single shot was a flat, definitive crack. The bullet found its mark. Court staggered back against the rock altar, a look of surprise on his face. He slid to the floor, his shotgun clattering beside him. The architect of the Heaven's Hope massacre was dead. Elara walked over to him, her face an impassive mask in the flickering firelight. She looked at the dead man, the third on her list. The wave of emptiness that followed was familiar now, almost expected. She retrieved her hatchet and turned her back on the dead man and the burning cavern. As she walked out of the Devil's Maw and into the clean, cool night air, she knew only one name remained: the head of the snake. Silas Kane. Her long, bloody hunt was leading her back home, to the place where it had all begun. The journey from the Sierra Nevadas back to the territory of her origins was a pilgrimage through a landscape of ghosts. With each mile that brought her closer to Heaven's Hope, the memories of her former life grew more vivid, more painful. The cold, focused purpose of the widow in red began to war with the deep, resonant grief of the woman named Elara. The road was no longer just a path to the final name on her list. It was a journey back through the ruins of her own heart. As she rode, the internal conflict that had been a whisper now became a roar. She had avenged her husband 3 times over. She had become a legend, a force of nature. But she was also profoundly, achingly alone. The brief moment of warmth she had felt defending the Homesteader family was a constant, nagging reminder of a life she could have had, a life she had sacrificed at the altar of her own hatred. She found herself thinking of David, not just of his death, but of his life. She remembered his easy laughter, the way he would hum off-key while fixing a fence, the quiet strength in his hands. These memories, once too painful to touch, were now the only thing that felt real in a world she had filled with death and shadows. She was fighting for a dead man, but in the process, was she killing any chance for the woman he had loved to ever truly live again? She made a stop, a detour that was not on her map of vengeance. She rode to the mountain sanctuary of Elias. She needed to see him, to anchor herself before the final storm. She found him on his porch, carving a piece of wood, as if he had been expecting her. He looked up as she rode in, and his old, weary eyes saw the change in her. The wild, burning fury was gone, replaced by a deep, haunted exhaustion. She was a soldier at the end of a long and brutal war. "It's almost done," she said, her voice quiet. "Only Cain is left." "I heard," Elias said, not stopping his carving. "The stories have found their way even up here. They say you're a demon who can't be killed." "I feel more like a ghost who can't die," she replied, a profound weariness in her voice. She slid from her horse and sat on the steps of his cabin. "I did a good thing, Elias. I saved a family. I used what you taught me to protect, not to kill." And it felt she trailed off, unable to find the words. "It felt like you were yourself again," Elias finished for her, his voice gentle. She nodded, a single tear tracing a clean path through the dust on her cheek. It was the first tear she had shed since she had buried David. "I don't know who I am anymore," she confessed. "When I kill Cain, what happens then? What is left of me when the hate is gone?" "What's left is Alara," he said simply. "The woman who has to live with the choices the widow has made. That's the hardest battle of all, child. It's not the one against the man with the gun. It's the one against the ghosts inside you." He went into his cabin and returned with a small, leather-bound book. It was his. "A journal. I was you once," he said, his voice a low rumble of memory. "A long time ago. I had a family. They were taken from me. I spent 5 years hunting the men responsible. I found them all. And when it was over, I was as empty as a dried-up riverbed. It took me 20 years of this silence, up here, to learn how to forgive myself. Not for what I did to them, but for what I did to myself." He handed her the journal. "You have to decide what comes next, Elora. Not the widow. You. Is your story a tragedy that ends with the last man's death? Or is it a story of survival?" His words, and his quiet, painful confession, struck her with the force of a physical blow. She was not alone in this. Her path was a well-worn one. She spent 2 days at his cabin, reading his journal, a sparse, brutal accounting of a vengeance that had cost him his soul. She saw her own journey reflected in its pages. When she left, she had made a decision. Her mission was the same. Silas Cain had to die. He was a cancer, and for the sake of the territory, for the memory of David, and for any semblance of justice, he had to be cut out. But her purpose had shifted. She was no longer fighting just to deliver an end to him. She was fighting for a beginning for herself. She would finish this, not as a ghost trapped by the past, but as a woman determined to have a future. She rode towards heaven's hope, her resolve now a different kind of hard. It was not the brittle, icy hardness of pure hate, but the resilient, tempered steel of a survivor. She was going back to the place of her greatest pain, the place where Alara had died and the widow had been born. She was going back to kill the last man on her list. But she was also going back to see if, in the ruins of the church where her life had ended, she could find a way to begin it again. Heaven's Hope was a town drowning in its own ghost story. The memory of the wedding day massacre had never faded, it had festered, leaving a permanent scar on the community's soul. The church, where the killings had taken place, had been abandoned. Its doors were boarded up, its windows were shattered, and it stood as a silent, decaying monument to a day of profound tragedy. The town was a place of quiet, fearful whispers, a community that had never healed. It was into this atmosphere of simmering dread that Alara returned. She did not ride in as a specter of vengeance. She came as a rumor, a whisper on the wind. She sent a message ahead of her, a letter delivered to the town's new sheriff by a passing trapper. The letter was simple. It announced that the last of the murderers of David and the people of Heaven's Hope, Silas Cain, was still at large. And it announced that the ghost of the bride had returned to finish her work. It ended with a chilling promise: she would meet Silas Cain in the ruins of the old church at high noon in 3 days' time. The news ripped through the town like a shockwave. It also reached Silas Cain at his fortified ranch, as Alara knew it would. Cain was a man besieged, not by an army, but by his own paranoia and the growing legend of the woman he had wronged. He had a choice: hide in his fortress and be branded a coward, or meet the ghost on her chosen ground. His arrogance, and his desperate need to end the terror that had consumed his life, forced his hand. He would go, but he would not go alone. He would bring the last of his hired guns, and he would turn the ruined church into a final, bloody graveyard for the woman who haunted him. On the appointed day, the sun beat down on a town that was holding its breath. The streets were empty. The citizens were barricaded in their homes, their windows and doors shut tight. All eyes were on the dilapidated church at the end of the street. Silas Cain and his 6 remaining men were already inside, their rifles resting in the shattered window frames, their positions carefully chosen. The church was a death trap, a perfect kill box. Cain stood at the ruined altar, the very spot where David had fallen, a cruel, triumphant smile on his face. He would end this blasphemy in the very place it began. At precisely 5 minutes to noon, a lone figure appeared at the far end of the street. It was Alara, and she was wearing the dress. The tattered, crimson-stained wedding gown was a horrific, brilliant statement against the dusty, drab backdrop of the town. She was not hiding. She was not a ghost in the shadows. She was an open, audacious declaration of war. In one hand, she carried her Colt. In the other, her hatchet. She began to walk slowly, deliberately, down the center of the street, her boot heels the only sound in the dead silence. "It's a trap, you fool," Cain hissed to his men from inside the church. "Wait for my signal. Don't fire until she's in the doorway." Alara continued her slow, inexorable walk. She reached the church steps. She paused, looking up at the broken doors, a place of so much pain. Then, with a calm resolve, she stepped into the shadows of the doorway. "Now," Cain roared. A volley of rifle fire erupted from the windows, a deafening, concentrated storm of lead that tore through the doorway, splintering the wood, winding through the air where she had just been standing. But she was no longer there. In the instant before they fired, she had thrown herself to the side, rolling behind one of the heavy stone pillars that supported the porch roof. The volley was for a ghost that had already vanished. Before they could reload, a new sound was heard. It was the thunder of hoofbeats, and it was coming from behind the church. The men Cain had posted at the rear windows yelled in alarm. A dozen riders, their faces grim, were charging the back of the church. They were the homesteaders, the independent loggers, the families from the surrounding territories whom Cain and his kind had terrorized for years, the very people Alara had encountered and, in some cases, saved. The preacher, standing in the town square, had ridden out and rallied them, telling them that the ghost who had fought for them was making her last stand. They had come not as an army, but as a reckoning. Cain's men were caught in a crossfire, their attention divided, their discipline shattered. The carefully planned trap was now a chaotic, two-front battle. In the confusion, Alara moved. She scrambled up the stone pillars and onto the roof of the church. She crept to the gaping hole in the roof above the main hall, awound from a fire that had been set during the initial massacre. She looked down and saw Cain, his face a mask of rage, trying to direct his crumbling defense. She dropped through the hole, landing in a crouch in the hay-filled choir loft, a place she had once sung as a girl. She was inside. The battle that followed was a brutal, chaotic symphony of violence. Outside, the townspeople fought with a desperate, righteous fury. Inside, Alara became a whirlwind of death. She moved through the shattered pews and the decaying shadows, a ghost in her own memory. She used the hatchet, she used the Colt, she used her knowledge of the building. One by one, Cain's men fell. Finally, it was just the two of them. Silas Cain, his army gone, his face bleeding from a shard of flying glass, stood at the altar. and Alara stood at the other end of the aisle. The blood of his men now added to the crimson stains on her dress. It always came down to this, didn't it? Cain snarled, raising his pistol. You and me. It was always only you, Alara said, her voice a low, final whisper. Their final duel was not a long, drawn-out affair. It was a single, explosive moment of truth. They fired at the same time. Cain's shot was wild, born of rage and desperation. It tore through the sleeve of Alara's dress, a final, impotent violation. Her shot, the last bullet she would ever fire in anger, was calm, certain, and true. It struck Silas Cain in the heart. He staggered back against the altar, a look of profound, final disbelief on his face. He slid to the floor dead, his body coming to rest on the very spot where his reign of terror had begun. The silence that fell in the wake of the final gunshot was more profound than any sound. Outside, the fighting had stopped. The last of Cain's men had been killed or had fled. The people of Heaven's Hope and the surrounding territories stood in the quiet street, looking at the ruined church, a tomb that had just become a crucible of justice. Inside, Alara stood over the body of Silas Cain, her Colt smoking in her hand. The last name on her list was crossed off. The great, roaring fire of her vengeance, the inferno that had consumed her life for so long, finally burned itself out. And in its place, as Elias had warned, was a cold, vast, and crushing emptiness. She had won. She had avenged David. She had freed a town. But the victory felt like ashes in her mouth. She was not unscathed. Cain's final bullet had torn a deep, bleeding gash along her arm. And during the brutal, chaotic fight inside the church, she had taken another wound, a knife cut to her side that was a mirror of the one that had almost killed her on her wedding day. She was bleeding, exhausted, her life's purpose now a dead body at her feet. She stumbled out of the church and into the sunlight. The crowd saw her, and a cheer went up, a ragged, emotional sound of relief and triumph. They saw their savior, the legendary widow in red, her tattered dress now a banner of their collective victory. But Alara did not see them. She saw only the ghost of her husband, standing on the church steps, his face full of a love and a sorrow that broke what was left of her heart. She had done this all for him, but in doing so, she had become a creature he would no longer recognize. She collapsed to her knees on the church steps, the Colt slipping from her nerveless fingers. The world was beginning to go gray at the edges. She had done it. She had fulfilled her vow. And now, she was so tired. The town doctor, Elias, pushed his way through the crowd. He had come down from his mountain when he heard the town was rallying. He knelt beside her, his old, sad eyes taking in her wounds, the profound weariness on her face. It's over, child, he said softly. You can rest now. Alara looked up at him, a faint, sad smile on her lips. Is it? She whispered. What happened next became the final, most debated chapter of her legend. Some who were there that day say that Elias and the preacher carried her away, that she was nursed back to health, and that one day she simply rode away, leaving the bloody dress behind, seeking a new life under a new name. They say she found peace. Others tell a different story. They say that her wounds were too great, that she died there on the steps of the church, in the arms of the old man who had trained her, finally reunited in death with the husband she had so violently avenged. They say she was buried in her wedding dress, a tragic bride to the very end. But the most common story, the one told by the old-timers, the one that became a myth of the West, is that as a dust storm suddenly blew up, obscuring the view, she simply vanished. One moment she was there, a bleeding, triumphant angel of death. The next, she was gone. Her body was never found. And so, the legend of the widow in red was never given a final grave. They say that on moonless nights, when the wind howls through the canyons of the territory, you can sometimes see her, a ghostly figure in a tattered, crimson-stained dress, forever walking the desert. Not a ghost of vengeance, for that debt has been paid, but a restless spirit, forever the bride, forever bound by an unending vow, a symbol of a love so powerful that not even death could break it, and a hatred so absolute that not even a grave could hold it.